Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon, sir.
Hello, Professor.
Okay, before we start today, are there any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
How many chapters does the final exam cover?
Well, it's going to cover chapter 7, 10, 11, 12, 15, and 16.
So 7, 10, 11, 12, 15, and 16?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Any other questions? Okay, before we start, let me just mention one thing to all of you here, which is very, very important. What I want you to do is to make sure you go over your grade book, and if you detect any discrepancies between your grade and what you think you should have, please let me know immediately. In other words, if you see that there is one grade or one score missing, let me know immediately. Don't wait till the last minute, because once I submit the grades, it would be extremely difficult for me to make a grade change. Changing a grade is not an easy thing. It involves so much, and it takes so much time, and it is so strenuous that I really don't like to go through the experience. So please make sure you look at your grade book and make sure that everything is complete. If you feel that something is missing, let me know immediately so we can make the necessary changes. Is this understood to everyone?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. Does everyone know when the final exam is? Again, for those of you who have no idea when the final exam is, it's gonna be on December 17 from 1 p.m. to 2:50 p.m. And you're gonna take the exam on titanium in the same way you took the midterm exam. Please make sure you only use Word doc to upload your answers. Do not use any images. No images are allowed. Everything has to be uploaded through Word doc. And then you go to titanium, and there is a final exam link on titanium. That's where you need to upload your answers. And again, please do not repeat the questions with answers. All I need is simply the answer to every question. In other words, I don't need you to upload the exam for me. I have the exam. I don't need it. So don't upload the exam. Just upload your answers. And make sure your answers are numbered. Question 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. Okay? It's very simple, very easy. So please don't make things complicated. All right. Today, what we want to do is we want to start chapter 16. This is the last chapter. On Thursday, we will start reviewing for the final exam. Now, I have pretty much posted all the notes to all of the chapters. So you should have the notes to all of these chapters handy. And I recommend and suggest that you should go over the notes very carefully, read them more than once. It's very easy to read. They're very straightforward, not very complicated, and not lengthy. So each chapter is pretty much summarized in 2 pages or 3 at the most. That makes it a lot easier for you to read. And I suggest you do that. And also try to, if you find that you need answers to questions, try to look at the PowerPoints as well. Now, some of you can obviously, skim through the book to find answers, but I think now it's a little bit too late. If you haven't read the chapters, it's too late to start reading them now. And that's the reason why I suggest you should focus right now on the PowerPoints and on the class notes. Okay, today the chapter deals with macroeconomic policy in an open economy. Now, in a closed economy, when there is no trade and no capital movement, the government has the responsibility of attaining internal balance in its economy. But what is internal balance? Internal balance simply refers to full employment without inflation and a balanced government budget. So these are the 2 objectives that all governments in a closed economy must achieve. Now, what kind of tools will the government use to achieve internal balance? Well, there are basically 2 tools: fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, fiscal policy includes the use of taxes and government spending. That's what fiscal policy is all about. The use of taxes and government spending to affect the level of economic activity through the shifting of aggregate demand. So in other words, if the government happens to spend more money in the economy, then aggregate demand will shift to the right. Or if the government wants to reduce taxes, then reducing taxes will also shift aggregate demand to the right. When you shift aggregate demand to the right, what you're doing here is that you are increasing aggregate income. That's what happens when you shift aggregate demand to the right. You are actually increasing aggregate income. You are increasing aggregate production. Okay, so that's what fiscal policy is. Now, we could have expansionary fiscal policy, which is used during periods of high unemployment, or we can use contractionary fiscal policy, which is used during periods of high inflation. Now, expansionary fiscal policy simply means increasing government spending or lowering taxes. Contractionary fiscal policy means reducing government spending and or increasing taxes. Now we use expansionary fiscal policy to take care of unemployment, to create jobs. And we use contractionary fiscal policy to put a lid on inflation. Okay, so that's fiscal policy. Now let's look at monetary policy. Monetary policy includes the use of open market operations by the Fed to affect the money supply and the interest rate, and thus the level of economic activity through the shifting of aggregate demand. That's what monetary policy is all about. Use of open market operations by the Fed. Now, expansionary monetary policy is used during periods of high unemployment, and contractionary monetary policy is used during periods of high inflation. Okay, so hopefully by now we all know what fiscal policy is, what monetary policy is, and what does the government use these two policies for? To do what? Okay, why will the government use expansionary monetary policy? Anyone?
Increase
High unemployment rates, and maybe like if the economy's doing really bad.
Very good. That's what expansionary monetary policy is used for, to create jobs, to get rid of unemployment. How about contractionary monetary policy? What is contractionary monetary policy used for?
slow down the economy, slow down the inflation rate.
Very good. To slow down the inflation rate, put a lid on high inflation. Okay, monetary policy, what does it mean? What is monetary policy?
Policies that affect how money flows, like taxes and stuff like that.
No. Monetary policy, we're talking about monetary, not fiscal. Monetary policy. What is monetary policy? What does it include?
Changing interest rates, hiring or lowering them.
Very good. It has to do with changing the money supply to affect the interest rate. Therefore, if we want to use expansionary monetary policy, we want to increase the money supply so as to lower the interest rate. So how does the Fed increase the money supply? How does the Fed increase the money supply?
Produce more money.
Yeah, but how do they increase the money supply?
Lower interest rates, print more money.
Create more money. How do they create more money? Purchasing bonds, government bonds. What does the government do when they purchase government bonds? In other words, the government will purchase bonds from firms, banks, individual households, whatever. And when they do that, when they purchase bonds, they are giving money in return for those bonds, correct? So that's how you increase the money supply. By the Fed purchasing bonds. And how do you reduce the money supply?
The Fed sells bonds.
Very good. The Fed sells bonds. So this is basically how it is done. It's not done through printing more money or less money. It has nothing to do with that. Increasing the money supply and reducing the money supply has to do with the buying and selling of government bonds. Okay, so when the Fed increases the money supply, what they will be doing here is that they will be reducing the interest rate. And when they reduce interest rates, this will lead to increase in consumption. It will also lead to increase in capital investment, which will lead to an increase in income, which will lead to an increase in imports. So that's what changes in the money supply would do. Very important to remember all of this.
Wait, I'm sorry. So you said that how they increase the money supply is they reduce interest rates, which
Mhm.
leads to an increase in consumption and capital,
Mhm.
which then leads to an increase in income and what else?
Increase in income, increase in imports. Okay, did everyone follow this? Very, very important.
I'm sorry, I have another question.
Yes,
So when they want to reduce interest rates, would that be under expansionary monetary policy or contractionary?
contractionary.
That's contractionary?
No, no,
Okay, and
reducing, I'm sorry, reducing interest rate, expansionary.
expansion, and then they would increase the interest rate for contractionary then, and it would just be backwards.
Correct, yes. So when they use contractionary monetary policy, that simply means reducing the money supply, increasing the interest rate, lowering consumption, reducing capital investment, and reducing imports. Why? Because you will reduce income. That's what contractionary monetary policy would do. Okay, so far so good.
One more time. So you reduce the money supply and then what?
Yeah, you reduce the money supply, the interest rate will go up. When the interest rate goes up, consumption spending falls. And investment in capital goods falls. And income falls. Imports will fall. That's what happens with contractionary monetary policy.
Okay, so sorry, I just just to make sure that like I understand this 100%. So when they want to do expansionary monetary policy, they're going to buy bonds from like banks or individuals to increase the money supply, and that in turn reduces the interest rates, and then that leads to increase in consumption and capital, and then increases in income and imports.
Correct.
And then it's just, okay, got it. Yep.
Yeah, correct. Okay. Now, in an open economy, things are going to get a little bit more complicated for policymakers who now have to worry not only about maintaining internal balance, but also external balance. Now, what is external balance? Now, we all know what internal balance is, right? Everyone knows what internal balance is. Anyone very quickly can tell us what internal balance is.
Full employment without inflation and a balanced government budget.
Very good, excellent. External balance refers to the balancing of trade, meaning we will have a trade equilibrium, which means we're not going to have a surplus and we're not going to have a deficit on our trade balance. We will have trade equilibrium. And also, we will have a stable exchange rate. What does this mean? This simply means that our domestic currency will not be overvalued and will not be undervalued. That's what external balance is. It has to do with the trade balance, and it has to do with the stability of the exchange rate. Policymakers are now committed to achieving overall balance. What does this mean? It simply means both internal and external balance. Will policymakers be able to achieve overall balance by simply using monetary and fiscal policies? The answer is no. The reason is simply because of the conflict that will exist in achieving overall balance simultaneously. For example, if we use expansionary monetary policy to take care of unemployment or a recession, then this will also lead to external balance translated into a trade surplus. In order to overcome the issue of conflicting goals, policymakers have to add more tools to their policy instruments, such as expenditure switching and expenditure changing policies. So what is expenditure switching? Expenditure switching has to do with shifting domestic output and consumption away from the home market to the foreign market. That's what expenditure switching is. In other words, instead of having consumers spend more at home, by consuming more domestic goods, what you will do here is that you will force consumers to switch their spending to foreign markets, buy more from outside rather than from inside. That's what is meant by expenditure switching. And you could do that either through adjusting the exchange rate or using trade policies, meaning more tariffs or less tariffs. That's how you encourage consumers to spend either more or less at home and abroad. So in other words, if you want consumers to spend less at home because your economy is having inflationary pressures and you don't want consumer expenditure to add to that inflation, so what you will do here is that you will force consumers to spend their money in foreign markets. This way, you will be able to relieve some of the inflationary pressures at home. However, if you have a recession at home, then what you want to do in this case is you want to encourage consumers to spend more at home. So you will use expenditure switching policies by adjusting the exchange rate, by either making the dollar more valuable or less valuable. This way you can force consumers to switch their expenditure. So for example, if I want consumers to spend more money abroad than at home, then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make the dollar more valuable by appreciating the US dollar. So when I make the dollar more valuable by appreciating it, consumers will find it a lot cheaper to buy goods from abroad because their dollar can buy a lot more goods in foreign countries than it can buy at home. So this is one way of using expenditure switching policies. So usually we use expenditure switching policy to take care of either inflation or recession. And the way we use expenditure switching is by adjusting the exchange rate or by using trade policies, by putting more tariffs on imports or by putting less tariffs on imports. So we will adjust our trade policy accordingly. And we will adjust the exchange rate accordingly so as to affect expenditure switching. So this is basically what expenditure switching policy is all about. Expenditure switching, again, has to do with shifting domestic output and consumption to imports and vice versa. In other words, you switch back and forth depending on what the objective is. Is your objective to take care of inflation or is your objective to take care of a recession? Now, under a fixed exchange rate system, a nation that faces a trade deficit can devalue its currency, thus making domestic goods cheaper and foreign goods more expensive. And this way you will be able to get rid of the trade deficit. This will induce people to spend more money on domestic goods and less on imports. So this way you will be able to take care of the trade deficit by devaluing your currency. Expenditure switching policy includes the use of tariffs and exchange rate adjustments in order to attain external balance. So hopefully by now, we know what expenditure switching policy is, and we know what are the examples of expenditure switching policy, and we know exactly why we want to use expenditure switching policy. Okay, can someone very quickly tell us what is expenditure switching policy? What is expenditure switching policy?
It's basically you're changing how how consumers like spend their money from either domestic to foreign markets.
Very good, excellent. All right, so that's one. The other question is, can you give me an example of an expenditure switching policy?
Like a real one, or like an example of like, if this is happening, then do this?
Yeah, in other words, if I want to use expenditure switching policy, what do I need to do?
Either adjust the exchange rate or do trade policy.
Very good, excellent, very good. Yeah, so pretty much you have everything under control here. Okay, so let's now keep moving. Expenditure changing policy affects the level of total spending in the economy, including those produced domestically or imported. And the expenditure changing policy includes both fiscal and monetary policy. So that's what expenditure changing policy is. It's both fiscal and monetary policies. We refer to both fiscal and monetary policy as expenditure changing policies. And we refer to exchange rate adjustments and trade policy as expenditure switching policy. Is this understood?
Is it kind of like how Trump put on like a bunch of tariffs on China and then wanted to increase domestic spending and domestic employment?
Yes. Well, this is one of the things that Trump wanted to do. However, obviously, President Trump had in fact, he had no idea what he was doing, basically. And, I'm sure that he has advisors, and his advisors would probably have told him exactly what he's in for. But, usually, Trump decides to do what he wants to do. And that's a big, big problem. But yeah, this is, what Trump wanted to do. He wanted to use tariffs basically to try and reduce the trade deficit. But obviously tariffs by themselves are not going to do that. As we said earlier on, if you remember, that the trade deficit must be attacked through saving and investment and not through trade policy. Trade policy is the last resort. You got to do first things first. And that is, you got to focus on your savings and investments. That's basically what you need to do. Anyway, so that's yes, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. So for clarification, expenditure switching is essentially the external balance, while expenditure changing is the internal balance that policymakers are like juggling.
Yeah, you could look at it that way. Very good. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that we have explained what overall balance is and what are the policy instruments available to achieve such a balance, we now turn to the implementation of such policies to achieving specific economic goals under both a fixed exchange rate system and a floating exchange rate system with free capital movement. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is we want to look at the effect of monetary policy under fixed exchange rate system. In other words, we want to find out how effective monetary policy is under a fixed exchange rate system. Okay, is everyone on board here? Does everyone know exactly what we're trying to do here? Again, we want to find out how effective monetary policy is under a fixed exchange rate system. So first of all, let's assume that the US government starts with a balanced budget and a recession. Okay, so the issue at hand here is a recession, and we want to get rid of this recession. So you have learned in this chapter that one way to get rid of a recession is by using expansionary monetary policy, correct? Hopefully this is what you learned today. Okay, so policymakers will use expansionary monetary policy by increasing the money supply and thus stimulating the economy. This will lead to a fall in the interest rate. Correct? Expansionary monetary policy is increasing the money supply, which leads to a fall in the interest rate. Now, a fall in the interest rate will do what to the flow of capital? Anyone?
It'll increase capital investment.
No, forget about capital investment here. We want to know what's going to happen to the flow of capital, financial capital. So let's leave capital investment alone for now. Let's just focus on financial investment, flow of capital, financial investment. When the interest rate falls, what happens to the flow of capital? Capital will flow out of the country. Correct? Because if the interest rate in the US falls, then you want to take your money and invest it somewhere else. So the flow of capital from the US will increase. So we will have outflow of capital from the US. Now, the outflow of capital from the US will put pressure on the US dollar. So what do you think this would do to the US dollar?
Decrease its value.
What's that?
Depreciate it. Depreciate its value.
Very good. It will depreciate the dollar. Why? Because dollars are moving out and they're going somewhere else and they are being exchanged for foreign currencies. So there will be more demand for foreign currencies. more supply of US dollars. This will lead to the dollar losing value. The dollar will depreciate. But wait a minute. We have a fixed exchange rate system. Because we have a fixed exchange rate system, we cannot allow the US dollar to depreciate. So what will happen here? The Fed has to jump in. What will the Fed do? The Fed will purchase US dollars in the foreign exchange market. So when the Fed purchases dollars, what will happen to the supply of dollars in foreign exchange market?
It reduces.
Very good. It will be reduced because the Fed is siphoning off this dollars from the foreign exchange. It's taking it out. So the supply of dollars will be reduced. And when the supply of dollar is reduced, what's going to happen to the interest rate?
It'll increase?
It will increase. Very good. So now, what has happened? Initially, we started with the impression that we want to get rid of a recession by increasing the money supply and reducing the interest rate. And now we are finding ourselves in a position where we have to reduce the money supply and increase the interest rate. So what does this tell us? This simply tells us that the effect of monetary policy under a fixed exchange rate system is weakened. This is the conclusion. That the effect of monetary policy will not be strengthened. In fact, it's going to be weakened under a fixed exchange rate system. In other words, this will cause a decrease in the supply of dollars and an increase in the interest rate, which will reduce investment and spending, and thus will counteract the initial expansion in the economy. Because initially, that's what we wanted. We wanted to expand the economy. We wanted to get rid of the recession. But what did we end up with? We ended up with exactly the opposite results. From this, we can conclude that the effectiveness of monetary policy is weakened under a fixed exchange rate regime. Okay, now let's look at the effect of fiscal policy under a fixed exchange rate system. What can we say about fiscal policy? Again, assume the US starts with a balanced budget and a recession. So the government or the policymaker will be tempted to use expansionary fiscal policy, i.e., increase in government expenditure in order to stimulate the economy. Now, for this to happen, the government has to finance its budget deficit. Because it started from a balanced budget, now the government is going to increase its spending, so this will lead to a budget deficit. Now the government has the responsibility of financing its budget deficit. How will the government do that? The government will do that by borrowing money. And how will the government borrow money? By issuing bonds, which will lead to an increase in the interest rate. So this is exactly what will happen. The government will borrow money by issuing bonds, which will lead to an increase in the interest rate. This will lead to capital inflow. Once the interest rate goes up, more money will start coming into the US. We will have capital inflow. Now, what will this do to the value of the dollar? Someone, very quickly.
Appreciate?
Very good. The dollar will appreciate. But wait a minute. We have a fixed exchange rate system. We cannot allow the dollar to appreciate. So what will the Fed do in this case? The Fed will be forced to intervene by selling dollars in the foreign exchange. This will cause an increase in the money supply and the fall in the interest rate, which will lead to increased spending, increased investment, and thus this will reinforce the initial effect. And this is exactly what we want to see happening. So from this, we can conclude that the effectiveness of fiscal policy is strengthened under a fixed exchange rate system. Is this understood? You see the difference between using monetary policy and fiscal policy under a fixed exchange rate system? Which one is more strengthened? Monetary or fiscal?
Fiscal?
Fiscal, very good. So please make sure you remember this. Don't get this wrong in the exam, please. Don't get it wrong. Now you know exactly what it is. And I've been saying this to my students for a long, long time now. And every time we get a question in the final exam, they get it wrong. And I start scratching my head. And I say, how can this happen? We went through it many, many times. And still students get it wrong. So please, please don't get it wrong.
Professor,
Yes.
what was the question you asked that the answer was fiscal policy?
Yeah, I said under a fixed exchange rate system, which policy is more strengthened?
Okay, thank you so much.
Mhm. So obviously, under a fixed exchange rate system, fiscal policy is more strengthened, monetary policy is weakened. The effect of monetary policy is weakened, the effect of fiscal policy is strengthened under fixed exchange rate system. Okay. The effect of monetary policy under a floating exchange rate system. Using contractionary monetary policy to correct for inflation, the Fed will reduce the money supply, which will increase the interest rate and thus reduce spending in the economy. That's exactly what the Fed would do, right? Which makes sense because you want to get rid of inflation. So if you want to get rid of inflation, you want to use contractionary monetary policy, which means reducing the money supply, which will increase the interest rate. This will reduce spending in the economy by putting a lid on inflation. Now, the increase in the interest rate will attract capital inflow, which will put pressure on the US dollar to appreciate. Because we are dealing with a floating exchange rate system, we don't have to worry about that. In other words, the exchange rate could go up or down. We don't care because it's a floating exchange rate system. It's not a fixed exchange rate. So there are no constraints here. So the increase in the interest rate will attract capital inflow, which will put pressure on the US dollar to appreciate. The appreciation of the dollar will make foreign goods cheaper and will lead to expenditure switching by US consumers. That's exactly what would happen. The appreciation of the dollar will make foreign goods cheaper and will encourage US consumers to spend their money abroad. In other words, it will lead to expenditure switching by US consumers. Again, this will help mitigate inflation by shifting expenditure away from US markets to foreign markets. From this, we can conclude that monetary policy is more effective under a floating exchange rate regime. Now, what do you think about fiscal policy under a floating exchange rate regime? Would it be more effective or less?
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat
Yeah.
the question?
What do you think fiscal policy will be under a floating exchange rate? Will it be more effective or less effective?
Less effective?
Very good, less effective. Excellent. So now I guess you got the hang of it, basically. Now, let's look at another question here. Under a fixed exchange rate system with free capital movement, if the US decides to use expansionary monetary policy to combat recession, what will happen to the trade balance and the capital balance? So again, under a fixed exchange rate system with free capital movement, if the US decides to use expansionary monetary policy to combat recession, what will happen to the trade balance and the capital balance? In other words, do we end up with a trade surplus or a trade deficit? Do we end up with a capital surplus or a capital deficit? Can someone give us an idea here? Again, this is another likely question in the final exam. Okay, this is how you need to tackle this question. First things first. Let's look at the expansionary monetary policy, because we want to use this policy to combat recession. So what are we doing here? We're increasing the money supply. An increase in the money supply will lead to a fall in the interest rate. A fall in the interest rate will lead to an increase in consumption and will also lead to an increase in capital investment. So far, so good. And this will lead to an increase in income, right? So expansionary monetary policy will always lead to an increase in income. Now, if there is an increase in income, what happens to imports?
They increase also.
They will increase. So what will happen to my trade balance? If imports increase, what happens to the trade balance?
It'll
If-
become unbalanced.
Comes what?
Unbalanced.
Yeah, but
Deficit.
deficit, very good. So we will end up with a deficit, basically. Okay, so we already took care of the trade balance. So we know we're going to end up with a deficit on the trade balance. Now, how about the capital balance? Okay, the capital balance, you need to know what's going to happen to the interest rate. What did we say will happen to the interest rate with expansionary monetary policy?
Decreases.
Decreases, interest rate falls. Now, if the interest rate falls, what happens to the flow of capital?
It goes elsewhere.
Exactly. So what will it end up with here in as far as our capital balance is concerned? Do we end up with a deficit or a surplus? If money is leaving,
Deficit.
deficit. Okay, so let's see if we answered them correctly or not. This will lead to a trade deficit and a capital account deficit. So we were right in both stance. Okay, and here I'm asking you, can you explain why this happens? And I'm giving you the answer here. Expansionary monetary policy leads to an increase in income and to an increase in imports, which will lead to a trade deficit. Expansionary monetary policy will lead to a fall in the interest rate and a capital outflow, which will cause a deficit in the capital account. Okay, let's look at another one here very quickly. Under a fixed exchange rate and high capital mobility, a contractionary fiscal policy leads to, well, I'm giving you the answer here, a trade surplus and the capital account deficit. Can you explain why? Can you explain this? Under a fixed exchange rate and high capital mobility, contractionary fiscal policy will lead to a trade space, capital account space. Can you explain why? Well, let's take it again, one by one. Contractionary fiscal policy means reducing government spending, which would mean when you reduce government spending, what happens to income?
Decreases.
Decreases. When income decreases, what happens to imports?
Decreases.
Decreases. When your imports decrease, what happens to your trade? Trade account. It would enter into a surplus, correct? Because if imports are falling and exports are staying the same, you're going to end up with a trade surplus. Okay, now let's look at our capital account. Contractionary fiscal policy. When there is contractionary fiscal policy, this means reduced government spending. When there is reduced government spending, that simply means there is a reduction in the demand for money because the government is not demanding money. They're reducing the spending. So what do they need the money for? There's not going to be any demand for money. So when the demand for money falls, what happens to the interest rate?
It increases.
What happens to the interest rate?
It increases.
Why would it increase?
For this is when we
Demand.
reduce government spending, right?
Yeah, there is no demand for money. We're not demanding money.
Interest rate decrease.
Decreases, very good. The interest rate would fall. Now, when the interest rate falls, what happens to our capital account? In other words, what will happen to the flow of capital? Will it stay in the US or will it move out?
Outflow.
It will move outside, outflow. So when there is an outflow, what will this do to our capital account?
There will be a deficit.
Be a deficit. Very good. So hopefully by now, you know how to answer all these questions. Please,
Professor,
please
could you
make sure you, well, yeah, go ahead.
could you repeat the explanation for the trade surplus, please?
Yes. Why will there be a trade surplus when there is a contractionary fiscal policy? Well, when there is a contractionary fiscal policy, that simply means there is a reduction in government spending. When there is a reduction in government spending, this will lead to a fall in income. When there is a fall in income, this will lead to a fall in imports. And when there is a fall in imports, this will lead to a trade surplus. Because remember, the trade balance is defined as exports minus imports. That's how we define the trade balance. Exports minus imports. So if my imports fall, I'm going to have a trade surplus. If my imports increase, I will have a trade deficit. Is this understood?
So in a contractionary monetary policy, the interest rate always decreases. It's never going to go up then, right?
The contractionary monetary policy, interest rate will go up.
Okay.
Contractionary monetary policy, interest rate will go up. Why? Because with a contractionary monetary policy, there is a reduction in the money supply. A reduction in the money supply will lead to an increase in the interest rate. Expansionary monetary policy, on the other hand, leads to an increase in the money supply. An increase in the money supply will lead to a fall in the interest rate. Is this understood so far? Okay, now I'm gonna leave this here. And for the few more minutes that we have, I'm gonna open the floor to questions. If anyone has any questions, yes.
Someone in the comments asked, is the class report single or double spaced?
Double space.
How about for the research paper? Do you want double space as well?
Yes.
Professor, this word, where exactly can we find it?
What's that?
This paper that we're reading off right now, the Word
Oh,
document.
this is already posted on Titanium. Just go to announcements in your Titanium portal and you will find it there.
Okay, thank you.
Has everyone found this, or? Has everyone found this posting?
Oh, it's underneath chapter 16. Okay, I found it.
Okay, good. Yeah, they are all on Titanium. I have posted all the notes for you. So you shouldn't have any problem locating these class notes. And these class notes will help you tremendously in the final exam. So make sure you go over them, read them more than once, try to understand them, because they are very, very simple. I tried not to use big words here. I tried to make everything as simple as possible. As you can see from the questions and answers that I'm giving you here, nothing sophisticated. And I'm sure if you go back to your book and you read this chapter, you will not be able to come up with these answers, because the book, unfortunately, does not give you many answers. Unfortunately, I don't know why, but except, a few here and there. But, you're going to spend a lot of time trying to dig the answers from your book. But here, the answers are straightforward, very clear, no beating around the bush, very direct, and, you should be able to answer any question that comes your way from the final by reading these notes.
What do you think the trickiest part of like the final is going to be? Like, if you were to tell us like to focus on some things, like what would be like a specific chapter or something that you would like recommend us? Like,
I would
to
say
really focus
chapter
on?
16. A lot of questions would be from chapter 16, chapter 15, and then chapter 11 and 12. Yeah, those are basically the 4 chapters that you would see a lot of questions from. 11, 12, 15, 16.
Thank
And
you.
then the other chapters, probably you get 1 question or 2, not more.
Will the final be multiple choice again?
Multiple choice and short answer questions.
Would you say like majority multiple choice and a couple short answers, or how?
Yes, mostly will be multiple choice, and you will have probably 5 problems that you need to answer. And hopefully we will talk about those on Thursday when we look at the review. And I recommend that you read the final exam review. Just go through the 35 questions or 37 questions that I have set for you. So make sure you use that as your roadmap.
I have a question about the monetary policy on the fixed exchange rate. So when the US government initially enacts the monetary policy, there will be a fall in the interest rate. But when the Fed intervenes, the interest rates actually increase. So is the Fed intervention going to be like the long-term effect of
Yes,
the monetary?
right. Yes.
Okay, so when you ask the question about
Initial and secondary. I may ask you, what would be the initial effect and what would be the secondary effect?
okay, so the initial effect is what happens when the US government enacts, and then the
Right.
secondary is the Fed.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Professor, are you going to post this on the YouTube?
Yes.
Okay,
This will be
thank you.
posted on YouTube. Yeah. Okay, any other questions?
Thank you.
You're welcome. I guess,
Hi, Professor.
yes.
I emailed you a week ago about the grade thing. I didn't receive any response yet.
Oh, the homework thing?
Yes.
Yeah, I will. Don't worry, I still have that on my mind. I just have been so busy, doing all the grading as well as the posting and I
Yeah.
was sick also for a while, so things started catching up with me. But no, I didn't forget you. I still
Okay.
have you on my mind, so don't worry about it.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. See you on Thursday.
Okay, see you Thursday all. Thank you very much for attending and participating. I really like your questions, and hopefully you have learned something today.
Thank you,
I have one
Professor.
question.
Yes, go ahead.
The class report is single space or double space?
Double.
Okay. And what is it about again? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
one-page summary of what
Mhm.
you have learned in class. What were the most important things that you learned? What were your expectations?
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, any other questions?
Will you be having office hours next week during finals?
Yes. Yes.
Is it the same time?
Same time.
Okay.
Monday and Wednesday. 3 to 4.
Okay. And then also about the writing assignment, I submitted a first draft back in September, and
Okay.
I think my draft is already a little over 3 pages.
Mm-hmm.
But you wanted me to add more to it, so should I just continue writing, or did you want me to like?
Just make the necessary changes that I recommended.
Okay, because I think I read your writing assignment details, and it says it should be 2 pages. So if it goes
Yes.
over, is that fine?
Try not to, get too much over.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Try to keep it within limits if you can.
Okay.
All right. Okay. So I'll see you all on Thursday. Take care and have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.
All right, thank you.